August 1945. The air over the Pacific Islands still smells of burned oil and salt. Inside a makeshift internment camp outside Manila, silence hovers above rows of bamboo huts and rusted wire. The war is over, but no one here feels peace. A group of Japanese women, once officers of the Imperial Army, stand barefoot on the packed earth. Their khaki uniforms are torn, insignias ripped away. They had been trained to die rather than surrender, yet they are alive, staring at the ground, faces drained of everything but shame. From across the compound, American Army nurses approach, women in pressed uniforms carrying bundles of folded fabric. No rifles. No orders shouted. Only quiet determination. One by one, they offer the Japanese women simple cotton dresses, plain undergarments, and soap. At first no one moves. Then a trembling hand reaches out. The rough cloth brushes against skin once wrapped in symbols of empire. Tears begin to fall, not from pain but from something harder to bear, kindness. That single act, one uniform replaced by another, marked more than surrender. It marked the moment when enemies stopped being enemies. But who were these women? And what brought them to this breaking point in history? Long before the war reached its fiery end in 1945, Japan had been building a nation that worshipped discipline, obedience, and sacrifice. From the late 1930s, the empire's every institution, schoolrooms, workplaces, even families, had been turned into engines of militarization. The government's message was clear: to serve the emperor was to live, to die for him was the highest honor. This ideology, rooted in the centuries-old Bushido code, extended beyond men. As Japan expanded its empire across Asia, women too were drawn into the machinery of war. They were nurses, communication officers, clerks, translators, but above all, soldiers of spirit. The Imperial Army trained them not only in their professions but in ideology. They learned to despise weakness, to hide emotion, and to see the Western enemy as barbaric invaders threatening their divine nation. By 1943, as Japan's manpower thinned, the military turned increasingly to women. Officially they were auxiliaries. In practice they were uniformed officers entrusted with authority. Many came from educated families, products of strict nationalism taught in girls' academies. Their training combined medical instruction with military drills and patriotic indoctrination. Some were even armed. They swore an oath before portraits of the emperor. They were told that surrender was dishonor, and capture worse than death. When Japan's empire reached its peak, spanning from Burma to the Philippines, these women found themselves scattered across distant garrisons and field hospitals. In places like Manila, Rabaul, and Okinawa, female officers worked beside men who fought and died believing they were defending the sacred home islands. But as Allied forces advanced, the tide of war reversed with devastating speed. The air raids began, relentless, merciless. Japanese positions were pulverized from the sky, cities burned, supply lines vanished. Entire divisions were cut off. 4 female officers, there was no home to return to, no clear command structure. Yet many continued working under bombardment, treating wounded soldiers and civilians, obeying their fading superiors. Letters from home stopped coming. News from Tokyo grew vague, then silent. By 1945, the once proud Imperial Army was disintegrating. Its soldiers faced starvation, disease, and hopeless defense. On Pacific Islands where surrender was considered shameful, mass suicides became common, among men and women alike. In Saipan, hundreds of Japanese civilians leapt from cliffs rather than fall into American hands. Still, in some outposts, groups of female officers were captured alive. Their survival alone defied everything they had been taught. Captivity was considered spiritual annihilation, a stain that would follow them forever. In the final months of the war, as Allied troops closed in, U.S. forces began encountering increasing numbers of female Japanese personnel. To American eyes, they were an anomaly, women in uniform from a culture that had seemed rigidly male-dominated. For the Japanese women, the experience was even more disorienting. The conquerors they had been told were monsters were now their only chance of survival. When Japan's unconditional surrender was announced on August 15, 1945, millions listened in disbelief to the voice of Emperor Hirohito, the living God speaking in human tones for the first time. Across the Pacific, in camps and garrisons, silence followed his words. The world they had known had ended. In places like the Philippines, Guam, and New Guinea, surrender orders reached the remaining Japanese personnel slowly. Confusion reigned. Many officers refused to accept it. Some burned their uniforms rather than wear the mark of defeat. Others hid in the jungles for months, unable to believe their empire had fallen. But those who were captured faced a new reality, one governed not by military code, but by the Geneva Conventions and American occupation policy. Among them were dozens of Japanese female officers, their sense of identity shattered. They were soldiers no longer. They were prisoners. And yet, even in captivity, they clung to a remnant of pride. Torn uniforms became symbols of their service, of their former honor. To remove them, to wear the clothes of their conquerors, felt like erasing who they had been. But soon that test would come. For as Japan's surrender spread across the islands, a quiet humanitarian mission began, led not by generals but by women in American uniform. The final year of the Pacific War was a descent into ruin. By early 1945, Japan's once mighty empire had been reduced to a chain of isolated outposts. The American island-hopping strategy had broken its defensive ring, one fortress at a time, Saipan, Leyte, Iwo Jima, Okinawa, each conquered with staggering casualties. In the midst of this devastation, Japanese women serving as army nurses, clerks, and officers found themselves trapped in battle zones meant to be temporary bases. Many had joined the Imperial Women's Auxiliary with patriotic fervor. They had been told they were protectors of the nation's soul. But as American air superiority grew absolute, the illusion of invincibility crumbled. Tokyo's propaganda still promised glorious death, but reality was starvation, infection, and hopelessness. Hospitals overflowed with the wounded, medical supplies vanished. Some Japanese nurses performed amputations with kitchen knives, sterilized only in boiling water. Reports from field hospitals on Okinawa described women who had not slept in days, their faces hollow, their hair turned white from shock before the age of 25. In these crumbling outposts, discipline held, barely. Officers ordered their subordinates to prepare for suicide rather than capture. Cyanide pills circulated secretly. Some units burned their records, flags, and even personal letters to erase evidence of their defeat. The idea that American troops might soon occupy their territory was considered unthinkable, even blasphemous. Yet, when the invasion came, many women saw something unexpected. American soldiers, though ruthless in battle, were not always cruel in victory. Reports from the Philippines describe U.S. medics providing medical care to captured Japanese personnel, including women, a shocking contradiction to everything Japanese propaganda had claimed. Still, surrender carried unbearable shame. 4 female officers who had been told their purity reflected the empire's virtue. Captivity was worse than death. The very act of survival felt like betrayal. When Japan finally accepted unconditional surrender after the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, word reached the scattered units in fragments. Some refused to believe it. Others wept quietly, not only for their country's defeat but for the collapse of the faith that had given their suffering meaning. In Manila, the Allied command began gathering prisoners of war from across the Pacific. Among them were a number of Japanese women, some captured during earlier operations, others surrendering after the ceasefire. They were brought to makeshift internment camps under U.S. military supervision. The Americans treated them according to the Geneva Conventions, but practical conditions were harsh. Food was rationed, disease common, and sanitation minimal. To the Japanese women, accustomed to strict hierarchy and ritual, the camps felt like limbo, neither life nor death. At first they refused aid. They refused to eat in the presence of American guards, refused to bathe, refused to speak. Their military discipline had been burned into them too deeply. Many wore their tattered uniforms as a shield, the last symbol of their vanished identity. Then something remarkable began to unfold. Among the occupying forces were American women, members of the Army Nurse Corps, the Women's Army Corps, WAC, and Red Cross personnel. They had served throughout the Pacific, tending to wounded soldiers and civilians alike. Now they were tasked with assisting in the repatriation and care of female prisoners. These women had grown up in a different world, one where education, independence, and civic duty were celebrated. To them, the sight of Japanese women in military attire was strange but not alien. They saw not enemies but exhausted human beings. Orders were given: treat all prisoners humanely regardless of rank or gender. So the American women went to work, distributing food, checking wounds, and eventually bringing clothes. But for the Japanese women, that act carried unbearable symbolism. Their uniforms were more than fabric. They were their identity, their last link to the world they had sworn to die for. To remove them was to accept defeat not just militarily but spiritually. Yet, in that tension between duty and mercy, humiliation and humanity, lay the story that would soon unfold in quiet, unforgettable scenes across the Pacific. And it was in one such camp, beneath the tropical sun of Manila, that the two worlds, conqueror and conquered, finally met not through battle but through a gesture of compassion. 1. The human angle, pride, shame, and silence. In the weeks following Japan's surrender, the camp outside Manila became a study in contradictions. The men among the prisoners often spoke openly, some relieved to have survived, others defiant to the end. The women, however, lived in near silence. Every gesture was restrained, every glance measured. They spoke only when necessary, often in whispers, heads lowered. Many of these female officers had never known life outside military structure. They had been taught that a woman's honor rested in loyalty, modesty, and service to the emperor. Captivity stripped them of all three. In Japanese society of the 1940s, shame was not a private emotion, it was a moral state. To be shamed was to lose one's social existence. And so, even among fellow prisoners, these women concealed their emotions, suppressing hunger, pain, and grief beneath a facade of calm. American officers who guarded the camp often misread their silence as hostility. It was, in truth, self-protection, the only way to preserve dignity when everything else had been taken. But cracks began to appear. A young nurse collapsed during roll call one morning, too weak to stand. Another wept quietly when an American medic treated her bandaged hands without cruelty. The wall of silence, built from years of indoctrination, began to tremble. 2. The cultural angle, purity, hierarchy, and the female ideal. To understand their resistance, one must understand what womanhood meant in wartime Japan. The state had elevated women as mothers of the nation, responsible for nurturing soldiers and instilling loyalty in children. Yet at the same time, it demanded absolute obedience from them, purity, modesty, and self-sacrifice above all. Even as they entered the military, women were expected to remain embodiments of virtue. Their uniforms carried a moral weight, khaki not as camouflage, but as a vow of chastity and devotion. Surrender, especially to foreign men, violated every layer of that ideal. The fear of being seen as defiled haunted these prisoners. They refused to undress before medical examinations. Some tore insignias from their uniforms rather than allow them to be handled by outsiders. For them, the war had ended, but the internal code of honor continued like a ghost that refused to die. What made the moment of receiving new clothes so charged was that it reversed this power dynamic completely. The enemy, once portrayed as corrupt and godless, was now performing an act of moral purity, offering care, not dominance. That inversion shattered everything these women had believed about themselves and the world. 3. The American perspective, compassion in uniform. For the American women assigned to the POW camps, the sight of Japanese female officers was deeply striking. Most had never seen Asian women in military attire before. They had been trained to treat enemy combatants as dangerous, but also to uphold humanitarian principles. Lieutenant Ann Harper, a nurse with the U.S. Army, later wrote in her diary, "They stood like statues. Not one word. Not even when we brought food. Their faces were unreadable, but their eyes were exhausted beyond description." Many of the American women had themselves faced discrimination in service. They had fought for respect in a male-dominated army. Perhaps that experience made them more attuned to the silent humiliation of their former enemies. They understood instinctively that compassion could wound as deeply as cruelty, yet it could also heal. When they proposed distributing civilian clothes to the Japanese prisoners, some male officers objected. "They're prisoners, not guests," one reportedly said. But the women insisted. "They're women too," came the quiet reply. The gesture was small, dresses sewn from surplus cloth, soap, and undergarments sourced from Red Cross supplies. Yet it carried symbolic power that far exceeded its material worth. For the moment of contact, when humanity crossed the line. When the American nurses entered the camp carrying the clothes, the air grew heavy with uncertainty. No orders were shouted. No translator gave speeches. The gesture spoke for itself. The Japanese women stood motionless, staring at the bundles as if they were relics from another world. For a long moment, no one moved. Then one nurse, her face thin, her uniform ragged, took a half-step forward. Her hands trembled as she accepted the folded dress. It was simple white cotton. She bowed, not out of gratitude but out of reflex, a movement from another life. When she tried to speak, no words came. Tears slid down her face. The others watched, and one by one their resolve cracked. Some covered their eyes. Others turned away. In that instant, something shifted in the camp. A quiet, irreversible recognition that war had ended. The American women did not gloat. They did not take photographs or demand thanks. They simply placed the remaining clothes down and walked away. Behind them the prisoners began to weep. Not for defeat, but for the strange mercy that had broken through it. But this moment of shared humanity did not happen in isolation. It was part of a larger psychological transformation, a process that would continue to unfold in the days that followed, as both sides grappled with what it meant to be human again. 5. The psychological angle, from indoctrination to awakening. For most of the Japanese female officers, the war had been more than a military mission. It had been a lifelong education in obedience. Since girlhood, they had been told that Japan was a divine nation, and that its emperor was a living god. Even the smallest act, from how they bowed to how they folded their uniforms, carried moral meaning. In that world, surrender was not merely failure. It was spiritual collapse. So when the American women entered the camp, their kindness struck a nerve deeper than any punishment could. It forced a re-evaluation of everything the prisoners had believed about the enemy. These women were not demons, not defilers, not destroyers. They were gentle, patient, and strangely dignified. At first, many prisoners resisted the emotional impact. They avoided looking into the Americans' eyes, focusing instead on the routines of camp life, folding blankets, scrubbing the floors, performing the motions of discipline. Yet the mind cannot resist truth forever. A nurse named Chiyoko later recalled, "They treated us like human beings. That was what we could not understand. We had been told they were beasts. But beasts do not bring you food." It was the slow undoing of indoctrination, the painful birth of awareness that war had deceived them. That realization did not come all at once, but in fragments. The way an American nurse smiled while bandaging a wound, or how a guard stepped aside to let a prisoner pass first. These small moments, trivial in isolation, became revolutionary in meaning. 6. The moral angle, compassion beyond victory. The gesture of giving new clothes carried profound moral weight. War reduces human beings to categories: soldier, enemy, prisoner, ally. Compassion erases those lines, if only for a moment. For the American women, that moment tested the depth of their own ideals. They had seen what Japanese troops had done in places like Bataan, Nanjing, and Manila, atrocities that left deep scars. Many had treated survivors of those massacres. Yet, standing before defeated women, they chose mercy over vengeance. It was not forgiveness nor pity. It was something quieter, a recognition that humanity is indivisible. In their reports, the American nurses did not describe the Japanese women as enemy personnel, but as recipients. The language itself reflected a shift, from warfare to care, from classification to compassion. Historians would later note that acts like these, small and unpublicized, played a crucial role in the moral foundation of the post-war reconstruction. They demonstrated that even in victory dignity could survive, not as a reward but as a choice. 7. The symbolic angle, clothes as redemption. Clothing, throughout history, has carried symbolic meaning: rank, class, purity, belonging. In this story, it became a metaphor for rebirth. The Japanese uniforms had represented hierarchy and loyalty, the idea that identity was defined by duty to the emperor. The American garments represented something radically different: individuality, freedom, equality. When the Japanese women shed their uniforms, they were not just changing clothes. They were crossing a psychological boundary, leaving behind the armor of ideology. The act was both humiliating and liberating. Some prisoners later said that wearing civilian clothing made them feel exposed, like ghosts among the living. Others described it as the first moment they could breathe without fear. In that transformation lay a deeper truth. The war had been fought not only with weapons but with symbols. And now, the most powerful symbol of all was not a flag or a medal, it was a simple cotton dress, given freely to an enemy. 8. The feminine parallel, women on both sides of the war. It is often said that wars are fought by men and endured by women. Yet in this encounter, women on both sides briefly stood outside that hierarchy. The American nurses and the Japanese officers had lived through the same war, though from opposite directions. Both had known the weight of expectation, the discipline of uniform, and the fear of being judged for weakness. That shared experience became the invisible bridge between them. When one reached out and the other accepted, it was not an act between victor and vanquished. It was between two women who understood, however faintly, the cost of loyalty. Some historians see this moment as symbolic of the larger transformation that would reshape Japan in the decades to come. After 1945, women in Japan began to enter new roles in society: teachers, activists, professionals. Their liberation, though slow and complex, had its spiritual roots in moments like this. where the idea of obedience cracked and the idea of selfhood quietly emerged. 9. The emotional resonance, tears as surrender. The tears that fell that day in Manila were not of fear or self-pity. They were the expression of something far more difficult, the recognition of one's own humanity reflected in the eyes of a former enemy. For years, these women had been told that emotion was weakness, that devotion required silence. But compassion is contagious, and tears are the first sign of healing. In the camp that afternoon, the sound of weeping spread slowly, not as a breakdown but as a release. The American nurses stood aside, understanding instinctively that no words were needed. History rarely records such moments. They do not alter borders or treaties, yet they define what kind of world emerges afterward. And as those tears fell onto the dust of a conquered empire, they marked the true turning point, not in strategy or politics but in the human heart. The camp lay on the outskirts of Manila, a repurposed military compound surrounded by barbed wire and sweltering humidity. It was mid-September 1945, 1 month after Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast of surrender. The official war had ended, but inside the camp, another battle was still being fought, the invisible one between pride and acceptance. Every morning began with roll call. The Japanese prisoners, both men and women, lined up under the rising sun. Their uniforms were faded, their boots split, insignias long removed. They bowed to the guards, not out of obedience but habit, a ghost of their old discipline. Among them stood Lieutenant Misako Tanaka, once a senior nurse in the Imperial Army's 3rd Medical Unit. She had been captured in the Philippines after refusing evacuation. Her hands, still scarred from treating burn victims during the final bombings, now clutched the edge of her torn tunic. To her, this ragged uniform was not mere clothing. It was the last proof that she had once served honorably. On that humid afternoon, word spread through the camp. American nurses were coming again. The prisoners stiffened. Some whispered prayers, others looked away. The previous visit had brought food and medicine. This time no one knew what to expect. A truck arrived, carrying boxes marked with the Red Cross emblem. From it stepped a group of American women, Army nurses and WAC officers, their faces composed, their movements deliberate. They carried bundles of fabric, folded neatly in their arms. They approached the women's barracks first. One of the American officers, Captain Eleanor Reeves, spoke gently through a translator. "These are clothes, for you to wear. You don't have to, but you can." The translator's voice quivered as he repeated her words in Japanese. The reaction was immediate, silence, heavy and suffocating. The Japanese officers did not move. To accept those clothes meant to strip away the last symbol of loyalty. Their uniforms, though filthy, were sacred. They represented their country, their emperor, their honor. To remove them, to put on the garments of the conqueror, was unthinkable. Captain Reeves and her team waited. No one reached out. A breeze swept through the camp, lifting dust and the faint smell of kerosene from the kitchen fires. Minutes passed. Still nothing. Finally, one of the American nurses stepped forward, a young woman named Margaret Holloway whose brother had died on Bataan. Her face was pale but her voice was steady. She held out a folded white dress to the nearest prisoner, Lieutenant Tanaka. Tanaka stared at it, unmoving. Her eyes filled with quiet defiance. To her, the gesture felt both humiliating and incomprehensible. Why would the enemy offer mercy? Why now, when defeat had already stripped them bare? But then, something in the nurse's expression disarmed her. There was no triumph, no mockery, only sincerity. Margaret's hand did not shake. The silence stretched until Tanaka's own resolve began to waver. Her arm, trembling, lifted slightly, not enough to take the dress but enough to show indecision. The gesture caught the eyes of the women around her. A murmur passed through the group. Another officer whispered, "Don't." Another said nothing. Then Tanaka took a deep breath. Slowly she reached out and accepted the folded fabric. Her hands touched the cloth, coarse, simple cotton. It was warm from the sun. For a moment she couldn't speak. Her lips trembled, her chest tight. Then, as if all the years of discipline shattered at once, she bowed deeply, not to surrender, but to acknowledge the kindness she could no longer deny. Behind her, a faint sound, a sob, broke the silence. Another woman began to cry, covering her face with both hands. Then another. Captain Reeves nodded softly. "Leave the rest," she said quietly. The American women placed the bundles on the ground and stepped back. No speeches. No orders. Just space for dignity to survive. The Japanese women remained standing long after the Americans had gone. Tanaka unfolded the dress in her hands, staring at it as though it contained a secret. She did not know what to do. To wear it meant to accept a new identity, to refuse it meant to deny her own survival. As the sun dipped below the wire fence, she walked toward the wash tent. She washed her hands, scrubbed the dust from her face and changed. When she emerged, she no longer looked like a soldier, but she no longer looked like a prisoner either. She looked human. Her comrades watched in silence, some crying openly, others still frozen in disbelief. One whispered, "It's over." Another murmured, "She's brave." For the first time since the surrender, the air in the camp felt lighter. The act was simple, but it carried the weight of an empire's collapse, and the first breath of something that might one day be peace. But the transformation did not end there. What followed in the hours and days after that moment revealed how deeply this act would echo, across the camp, across nations, and across time itself. That evening the camp was unusually quiet. The guards, accustomed to shouting orders, spoke in low tones. The prisoners ate without the usual formality. Something indefinable had shifted in the air, a silence not of oppression but of introspection. Inside one of the bamboo barracks, a group of Japanese women gathered around a dim kerosene lamp. The smell of soap lingered faintly, the first scent of cleanliness many had experienced in months. Lieutenant Misako Tanaka sat among them, still wearing the simple white dress. The fabric clung to her shoulders awkwardly. She wasn't used to clothing that wasn't military issue. At first no one spoke. Then one officer, her voice trembling, said, "You look strange." Tanaka smiled faintly. "I know," she said. "It feels wrong." Another woman whispered, "It feels free." No one dared to agree aloud, but they all understood. For the American women, the event was equally unforgettable. Captain Eleanor Reeves wrote in her field journal that night, "We didn't win them with power. We reached them with mercy. Today I saw a woman stop being a soldier." Her entry, preserved in post-war archives, reveals something profound. That victory, when divorced from vengeance, becomes something else entirely. It becomes peace. Over the next few days, more Japanese women came forward to accept new clothes. Some did so quietly at night, slipping into their dresses after washing at the communal pump. Others folded their uniforms neatly, as if performing a funeral rite for the world they were leaving behind. One American nurse later recalled how a group of women approached her tent, holding their old uniforms in their hands. They bowed and placed them down carefully. She asked the translator what they said. The reply was simple. They said thank you. And goodbye. In the tropical dusk, piles of khaki cloth lay on the ground like fallen leaves, each one a symbol of a vanished empire. The Americans burned them later at the prisoners' request, in a controlled fire behind the mess hall. The smoke rose slowly into the night sky, carrying with it decades of indoctrination, pride, and pain. To the prisoners the fire was purification. To the Americans it was closure. Yet not all could accept it. Some Japanese officers refused to change clothes, choosing instead to remain in their uniforms until repatriation. For them, identity was too deeply fused with service to be undone by compassion. They stood apart, rigid and silent, unable to weep, unable to adapt. Their resistance was not defiance, it was grief. But for many, the gesture unlocked something human long buried beneath duty. They began to interact with the American women, cautiously at first, then with genuine curiosity. They exchanged smiles, words of broken English, gestures of thanks. A Red Cross nurse noted that one of the Japanese officers offered her origami birds folded from a ration label, a token of respect. Another drew a portrait of her American counterpart, signing it with her old military seal. These were small acts, fragile and fleeting, but they carried immense weight. Even the guards, hardened veterans of brutal campaigns, felt the atmosphere change. One sergeant later told a reporter, "They weren't the enemy anymore. They were just people trying to go home." The most remarkable transformation, however, was internal. The Japanese women began to speak, not to confess but to remember. They told stories of their training, their families, their lost comrades. Some spoke of how they had joined the army believing they were serving a divine purpose, only to discover too late that they were serving death. Captain Reeves listened to them with quiet attention. "They are not our enemies," she wrote. "They are the victims of the same machine that consumed us all." In that moment, the camp ceased to be merely a place of captivity. It became, in its own quiet way, a place of reckoning, a laboratory of human conscience where the boundaries of nationality and ideology dissolved in the face of shared sorrow. When the time came for repatriation, the Japanese women boarded ships back to their homeland not as soldiers, but as survivors. Many carried the American dresses with them, folded carefully in their luggage. They would wear them again upon arrival, some out of necessity, others as reminders. For Lieutenant Tanaka, that white cotton dress would become her most sacred possession. Years later she kept it in a wooden box in her home outside Tokyo. She never wore it again, but she never threw it away. When asked why, she replied softly, "Because that day I learned that even the enemy can give you back your humanity." The war that had begun with absolute conviction ended, for her, in tears and mercy. And in those final weeks of 1945, across dozens of camps scattered across Asia and the Pacific, similar moments unfolded, acts of compassion so quiet they never made the headlines, yet so profound they helped heal a shattered world. But what happened after these women returned home? How did Japan, humiliated, occupied, and reborn, treat the soldiers who had once served its empire in silence? When Japan officially surrendered on September 2, 1945, the empire ceased to exist. But for millions of returning soldiers, men and women alike, the end of war did not mean peace. It meant reckoning. The Japanese women who returned from Allied custody arrived to a homeland they no longer recognized. Tokyo was a skeleton of stone and ash. Entire neighborhoods had vanished beneath American firebombs. In the ports of Yokohama and Sasebo, repatriation ships unloaded thousands of weary faces each day, wounded, starving, broken. Among them were the former nurses, clerks, and auxiliary officers of the Imperial Army, the same women who had once stood proudly in khaki uniforms. Now they disembarked in plain cotton dresses, many of them given by American women. Some were barefoot, others carried only a small bag containing ration biscuits or photographs. There were no parades for them. No medals. No official recognition. In post-war Japan, surrender carried the weight of dishonor. For female officers, the stigma was doubled. They had violated not only their nation's militaristic code but its deeply conservative gender norms. In rural towns, neighbors whispered behind closed doors. Families urged their daughters never to speak of their time in the army. For years, many hid their identities, burning documents and burying memories. The white dresses they had been given in the camps became secret symbols, of shame to some, of redemption to others. Historians later found that several of these women, especially those who had served in occupied territories, faced ostracism or unemployment. Some married quietly and built anonymous lives. Others joined the wave of social reconstruction, becoming teachers, nurses, or volunteers in Japan's new democratic institutions. The Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, imposed sweeping reforms on Japan: demilitarization, women's suffrage, and constitutional pacifism. Ironically, many of the same women who had once served an empire now benefited from the rights it had denied them. Education opened to them, voting became a legal right, careers beyond domestic life became possible. Still, the ghosts of war followed them. Lieutenant Misako Tanaka, who had once led field units in the Philippines, was interviewed in 1948 by an American journalist visiting Tokyo. Her home was modest, a single tatami room with paper windows and a wooden chest. When asked about her wartime service, she hesitated before replying, "We believed we were serving our emperor. Then I met American women who treated me as an equal human being. That was the beginning of my freedom." That sentiment, quiet, personal, and honest, captured the paradox of post-war Japan. A generation of soldiers, both male and female, had to redefine what it meant to be loyal, honorable, and human in a world where the emperor's divinity had dissolved. For many Japanese women, the end of the war was the beginning of visibility. During the 1930s and early 1940s, they had been mobilized as patriotic women, expected to serve behind the front lines, in hospitals, communication centers, and munitions factories. Now, stripped of uniform and ideology, they began to find their own voices. Some former army nurses became advocates for peace, using their medical training in civilian hospitals rebuilt with Allied aid. A few even corresponded with their American counterparts years later, exchanging letters about children, work, and the fragile hope of never seeing another war. But not all stories ended with reconciliation. There were darker echoes too, reports of suicide among officers unable to bear disgrace, of women who died anonymously in refugee shelters, or those who vanished into the ruins of Tokyo, unwilling to return to families who no longer recognized them. Yet, collectively, their experience carried a lesson deeper than defeat. It revealed that mercy had power, the kind of power that no bomb or army could achieve. The moment those American women offered clothes and compassion had not erased guilt or history, but it had planted a seed of humanity that would, in time, grow into Japan's transformation. The empire had fallen, but the women it once used as instruments of war were quietly shaping a different Japan, one where strength was measured not by conquest, but by endurance, empathy, and renewal. But how did the world remember these women, and how did Japan's collective memory treat their small acts of surrender and grace in the decades that followed? In the years following Japan's surrender, the nation rebuilt itself at astonishing speed. By the 1960s, the cities once scorched by firestorms had risen again, Tokyo a forest of neon lights and ambition. But in that new modern Japan, the women who had once served its lost empire were ghosts. Official records mention them only briefly, often under bureaucratic terms like military auxiliaries or nursing corps personnel. Their faces vanished from public textbooks, their service omitted from national narratives that preferred to celebrate industrial growth over the memory of defeat. Yet privately their memories endured, in attics and faded photographs in the quiet pages of diaries. Historians and journalists who later interviewed surviving female officers found a striking pattern. Most of them described the moment of surrender not as humiliation, but as awakening. They spoke less about military orders and more about the day the Americans handed them clean clothes. One elderly former officer, interviewed in 1983 for an NHK documentary, said through tears, "We were ready to die for Japan. But that day they made us live, and living was the harder task." Her words echoed a truth often overlooked by official history, that survival in its own way was an act of courage. In the post-war decades, cultural silence about women's roles in the war remained strong. Japan's collective remembrance tended to frame women as victims, of air raids, of poverty, of military men. But the women who had worn uniforms complicated that narrative. They were neither wholly victims nor villains. They existed in the gray space history often avoids, participants in a war they didn't design but could not escape. Some of them began to speak publicly during the 1970s, as Japan's peace movement grew and younger generations began questioning wartime ideology. A few former officers joined reconciliation organizations, writing letters to American veterans groups and even meeting with the same Red Cross women who had aided them decades earlier. At one such meeting in 1975 held in Honolulu, a Japanese delegate presented an American nurse with a folded white dress, preserved since 1945. It was the same kind of dress once given to her in captivity. "You gave me this," she said, "when I had nothing left. I wanted to live where people can see what mercy looks like." That dress now rests in a glass case at the National Museum of American History in Washington, labeled simply, "Repatriated Prisoner's Garment, Philippines, 1945." To most visitors, it is just cloth, plain, unadorned, unremarkable. But to those who know its story, it represents the quiet revolution that followed the gun's silence. The moment when two nations' women, once divided by empire, saw one another simply as human beings. In Japan, younger scholars have since begun to re-examine these women's lives, not as propaganda tools or forgotten auxiliaries, but as individuals caught in the machinery of total war. Their testimonies now appear in university archives and oral history projects, giving faces and voices to a generation that endured both indoctrination and liberation. Yet even today their legacy remains contested. Some nationalists view their surrender as weakness. Others see it as the first step toward Japan's rebirth as a peaceful nation. Between those extremes lies the quiet truth, that compassion, extended even in victory, changed more hearts than punishment ever could. When Lieutenant Misako Tanaka died in 1992, her family found among her belongings the same white dress, still carefully folded in its wooden box. She had kept it for nearly half a century. Alongside it lay a letter written in delicate handwriting, never sent. "To the women who clothed me when I was defeated, you gave me back my dignity. The empire taught me how to die. You taught me how to live." That final line, discovered years after her death, speaks for countless others whose names history never recorded. Their war began with loyalty and ended with tears. But within that surrender was a victory greater than any nation's, the victory of empathy over hate, of humanity over ideology. And from that transformation, a new Japan would rise, one determined never to let such mercy be forgotten. History often remembers wars through numbers, battles, casualties, tonnage of bombs. But the truth of war is not only in its destruction, it is in the fragile moments when destruction stops. In the final months of 1945, the world saw one of the most complete defeats in human history. Empires collapsed, ideologies burned, and entire nations stood in ruins. Yet, amid that chaos, something remarkable occurred, a gesture so small that few history books ever mention it. American women handed their former enemies clean clothes. It was not policy. It was not strategy. It was humanity. For the Japanese women who had lived their lives in obedience to an empire that promised honor through death, kindness was an unbearable shock. But that shock, over time, became transformation. It dismantled indoctrination in a way that no tribunal or treaty could. It reminded them, and the world, that even after the unthinkable, dignity can still be restored. Every empire believes itself eternal. Yet all of them fall. What endures are not banners or borders, but the small human gestures that rebuild what war tries to erase. Those American nurses never saw themselves as heroes. They were tired, homesick, and frightened in their own ways. But in choosing compassion, they altered history's texture. They made the surrender of an empire into the beginning of peace. In the decades that followed, Japan would become a nation defined not by conquest but by resilience, by its ability to transform suffering into progress. And within that transformation lies the echo of those quiet exchanges in the tropical heat. Uniforms traded for dresses, shame for mercy, silence for understanding. When historians speak of victory, they often speak of the side that fought hardest. But real victory, perhaps, belongs to those who remembered to be kind when every reason existed not to be. Because in that camp, on that humid afternoon in 1945, the war ended twice. Once through surrender and once through compassion. And it is that second ending, unrecorded, uncelebrated, yet deeply human, that still reminds us, the greatest act of power is mercy.